Hey everybody, we are Robert, Martin, and Francis, and this is Snakes and Otters, pointless discussion of eternal questions. Get ready, we're about to live in your head rent-free. Welcome back to Snakes and Otters, everyone. I'm Robert.
I'm Martin.
And I'm Francis.
All right, this is episode 49. This is one of our history episodes that we're going to do. And our topic today is going to be the first of 4 upcoming episodes on the Civil War, the American Civil War, for those of you not listening in America. And this first one we're calling Burnside's Folly, the Battle of Fredericksburg. So we're going to talk about Ambrose Burnside and the absolutely disastrous battle and leadership of the Army of the Potomac that was his to call his own. Now, next month when we do this, we're going to move on to chronologically the next big battle, which is Chancellorsville, called Lee's Masterpiece, the Battle of Chancellorsville. After that, of course, will be in July, so we'll be doing the Battle of Gettysburg, and that will be a what if. We haven't done a what if in a while, so I'm really looking forward to that one. What if Stonewall Jackson was present at Gettysburg? And then we're going to finish up the Civil War series with the one that Martin is very anxious to do, and that is The Key in Our Pocket, Grant's Victory at Vicksburg. So I know he's really anxious for that one, just like I'm anxious for the what if and Gettysburg. You know, that's Gettysburg. Really, that's one we all have a special place in our hearts because that's where our Civil War fascination really kicked off. Was with Gettysburg.
Yeah, and we've been there together.
And we've been there together. That's true. That was one of the greatest man trips that we have done.
It'll be 20 years ago this November, actually.
Yes, you are correct. You are correct.
Yes. We walked the Pickett's Charge battlefield area.
I tell you what, I think that was one of the highlights, just in the sense that that was just one of the most moving things about that battlefield, walking that stretch.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that Sunday morning was really awesome. We did it in 3 days, and it's a 10-hour drive one way. So we rode hard and saw everything and rode back again.
That's right. So before we digress too much on Gettysburg, because we're 2 episodes away from that, let's get back to Ambrose Burnside. So, interesting man. Martin has some biographical information. Let's do a little bit of background on the man, and we'll take off from there.
Well, you know, Ambrose Burnside is one of history's great examples of the Peter principle.
Yes.
He got promoted pretty much to the level of his incompetence. He was a professional. He's not a political general. He was a West Point guy.
Yeah.
Interestingly, when he graduated, he was posted to the artillery and not to engineers or cavalry, which are, of course, the desired posts. He did see some combat in the West, but missed out on combat during the Mexican-American War. His unit arrived too late to take place in any combat, and like many professionals in this era, he would eventually resign his commission in the 1850s to go into business. He had designed a firearm, the Burnside carbine, and was going into business to produce that weapon. And much like some of the other generals, Grant and Sherman in particular, who also resigned their commissions to go into business, the business failed. And at the start of the war, he was pretty close to broke. He was working at a railroad, working for George McClellan. So when the war starts, of course, all the professionals are brought back in, and again, his relationship with McClellan helps him. But curiously, he basically understood himself that he was not the kind of guy that should be in command of a large army. So he initially refused command of the Army.
3 times, wasn't it? 3 times? Mm-hmm.
Yeah. He only accepted it when Lincoln said he was going to give it to Joe Hooker, and Burnside couldn't stand Joe Hooker, so he said, "Yeah, I'll take it." But he's just one of those guys that just didn't. He was a good soldier. He could take orders, but he just doesn't have that imagination really to plan and follow through with command of a large force like the Army of the Potomac.
Yeah, and I think that's probably the key to understanding his failures on the battlefield, and where he had success. He didn't have spectacular success, but he was competent below that level of commander of the army. He was not one of those guys that just slaughtered his men for no reason, which we know we've seen on the battlefield because they didn't know what they were doing. He was a guy that he was, and I imagine this is why he was good at the railroad, because he went back to that multiple times. So he didn't screw that up so badly that another railroad wouldn't hire him. And I think that's because the railroad is one of those things that speaks to his strength, and that is he can organize and plan and you execute it. You don't need to be dynamic. You don't need to think on your feet because the railroad schedules are the railroad schedules. That's what they are. It's not like you're laying down some new track because you need to go over here this day. You're going on the same track every single day. And that probably appeals to his strengths.
Well, he's a perfect example of the code of honor quotation that you gave last time, Robert, that once the shooting starts, then the plan goes, it's done. And
the excrement hit rotary impeller.
Oh, very good. I like that. That's very good. That's exactly right. And Grant was famous for this.
You mean that again, Robert?
It's when the excrement hits the rotary impeller.
All right.
That's exactly. I love it. Absolutely, I love it. Yes. But he's famous, and I think he knew on some level that he couldn't do that. That that wasn't what he was. I mean, he knew himself well enough. I think Martin, you said this at the beginning. He knew himself. He didn't want to take this, but as you say, he also knew that Joe Hooker would be an absolute disaster, which of course history confirms him in that. Which our next episode will talk a little bit about that. And I just find him fascinating that he knew his own weaknesses, and yet he still was subject to them.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that I think is one of the my former pastor used to say, our greatest strengths are often our greatest weaknesses. And that's true for Burnside. His strength is that organization, that ability to follow a plan. But his weakness is he can't deviate from the plan.
Yeah.
So they're very much tied together. Before we go on, let's. I want to pause because we didn't do this at the beginning of the episode. We are still on lockdown. We are all actually broadcasting from our own home offices.
That's right.
So we probably sound a little bit different than we have in past episodes. So, I'm sitting here in my basement. Martin's in his, and Francis is in his office. Not in his basement. He's out of the man cave, and he is on the first floor.
First floor of the back of the building, yes.
I am so jealous. We're in the middle of lockdown still. Those of us who can work from home still are, and we are at this point no end in sight. And this is our first episode in the month of May, obviously. So it is May Day, May 1st. So all kinds of big things around that. It's just lots of significance about what's going on and what date it is. I just wanted to throw that out there. I'd like to raise a glass of bourbon.
Yes, so we're not sharing bourbon. We're
not sharing.
From our own glass, our own bottles.
That's correct.
That's right.
Yeah.
I am drinking some of my favorite, the Woodford Double Oak. It is my absolute top go-to bourbon.
I went back to my top bourbon, Basil Hayden, which I still have plenty of that on hand. So it's kind of my
very good bourbon.
Very good.
And Martin, what do you have today?
I've got some Larceny. I just opened the bottle.
Excellent.
So, clink, clink, clink. It's a brand new, fresh bottle of Larceny. It's tasty.
Yes. So, anyways, I want to raise a glass. I want to give a toast to those who are working in the medical profession, those who are on the front lines dealing with this, and also those in the service industry that still have to man their jobs and have to deal with the grocery store, the Lowe's, the Home Depots, those that are deemed essential services for whatever reason, because they're really, literally putting their lives on the line for the rest of us. So,
and shippers and truckers.
And truckers, yes, absolutely.
Oh, yeah, the whole logistics
warehouse people,
industry, yes.
The whole supply chain is really hidden heroes. They go to work every day just like everybody else, but nobody really thinks about the jobs they do because it is so hidden. But not anymore. It's really been kind of brought to the forefront.
Yep. They're keeping America fed, and
they are
surviving.
May not be able to keep the toilet paper on the shelves, but they're keeping us fed.
It keeps coming, though. It keeps coming.
That's the key.
That's right.
We'll refill.
That's right.
That's the beauty of it. It's not like the Soviet Union where you would get toilet paper once every 6 months. No, you get it every few days.
That's right. So a toast to them and to their safety.
Amen to that. Hear, hear.
Okay, so back to Burnside. So, as with a lot of the guys we bring up, and I say guys specifically because we have yet to do a female on our heroes, and that is something we are looking to correct. So those of you out there thinking, man, these guys are just a bunch of sexists. No, we just haven't gotten around to the ladies yet.
Well, yeah, they're there. We're working on them as we speak.
We're guys. I mean, there's probably some of that. Guys pick guys, ladies pick ladies. So, but we are going to try and branch out to be to broaden the perspective, so to speak.
Broaden the perspective. I like that.
Yes,
that's a good way to phrase it.
So
there's heroes everywhere.
There are. Yeah, I mean, as we just talked about, those guys are heroes on the front line, yes, guys, the generic sense. So. Interesting thing about him, as we've talked about Burnside, is that he's probably more self-aware than many of his peers, in the sense that he knows he's more self-aware than those who are unsuccessful. Those who are successful, Grant is very aware of his failings and his strengths, and I think the people he surrounds himself with are as well. He knows what he is good at. He knows what to stay away from, which is the drink.
Right.
But Burnside, he's probably one of those rare cases where he is good to a point, and he knows that, and yet he still has to go beyond it. And he's not a butcher in the sense that he sends men off to die just because, by God, we're going to take that hill. And damn the cost. I don't get that sense from him. So he's
although it was butchery that he ended up
center.
Yeah,
it was
ended up being that way, but not by that intention.
Right. Which is, I think, different than a lot of the guys who failed in his job or jobs like it. And I found that a little bit interesting. Now, one side note here before we really dive into the battle. A lot of people who don't know Civil War history, don't know Burnside, are probably thinking, what's the deal with the name? Isn't his name Sideburns? No. It's where we get the term.
That's right.
They initially were called Burnsides because he had those mutton chops, but nothing on the chin. So it was all sideburn and mustache. And he could grow a really good one. I got to admit, he could grow a really good one. And he was known for them, and eventually that's what they started calling him was Burnsides, and they switched it around to Sideburns for whatever reason. So that is where we get that. So he's famous for one good thing, and that's the facial hair. So, Fredericksburg. The Union Army is coming off of a large period of inactivity for the most part. After the Battle of Gettysburg in the summer of 1863, the Battle of Antietam in 1862. I'm getting my battle mixed up.
September 62.
September 62. It was a win for the North, but like many of the wins in the Civil War, it's one of those, we can't do too many more wins like this or, we're defeated. It was a costly win for the North. So there was a definite necessary period of rest and refit that was needed. And of course, during this time, McClellan manages to, I don't want to say bungle his way out of leadership, but kind of, because it was at this time that I think Lincoln sent him the message, if you're not going to do anything with the Army, I'd like to borrow it.
Right. Yes.
So, because that was the problem. He wouldn't use the Army. The Army of the Potomac was well trained, and it was massive compared to Lee's Army.
Yeah, McClellan was an immense and wonderful trainer, but that's about it. And he thought he considered himself the little Mac, the little Napoleon. He thought himself all this great stuff. He's one of those people, unlike Burnside, who knew his limitations. He didn't think he had any, and he continued that way. And he hated Lincoln. Lincoln tolerated him. Oh my God, so long, because the men loved him.
The men loved him, and he did a good job in camp.
That's right.
And he wasn't entirely unsuccessful. His problem was he wouldn't be bold.
Right. And Lincoln demanded that. And
yes.
He had to, because he knew, because Lee certainly didn't suffer from that failing by any means.
No. Well, and that's what enabled Lee to be successful, was he was willing to be bold and take risks that other generals were not at this time.
Yeah. And it was Lee's only chance.
And it was Lee's only chance was to be bold. He understood this.
To take long chances.
So it actually worked very well to Lee's advantage, too, because he's up against McClellan, during the Peninsula Campaign. And I don't know if Lee knew McClellan very well or how well, but the two were just, they were made for each other, because McClellan is absolutely going to get smacked every single time because Lee is bold and he is not.
Yeah. So that's the background for Ambrose Burnside taking command of the Army of the Potomac. He knows he has to be bold. He has to take action. That's basically the mandate. You have the job, and the job is to do one thing: attack.
Right.
So that's the environment. Now, there's some maneuvering that's going on because, it's winter. This is December, and nobody likes to fight in the winter, for good reason. And yet he's got to attack. So the Confederates managed to maneuver him into a position where he's on one side of the Rappahannock and they're on the other, and he has to cross. Yet the Confederates have basically done a good job of destroying all the bridges in the area, and so he has two choices. He can either move down the river and ford it to get over to that side, in which case, for all he knows, the Confederates will just move on and continue this war of maneuver, and basically it's its own war of attrition in its own way, because it's very difficult on the armies to keep doing this in the dead of winter. Or he can build pontoon bridges and cross at Fredericksburg. He chooses the latter because he feels like he has to take action. So that's the environment. Now, Fredericksburg is elevated. It's on a river, so the river is going to be at the lowest level by definition. The river is always the lowest geographic level because that's where the water descends to. So the Confederates have the high ground. And if they had seen Revenge of the Sith, they would know you don't attack if your opponent has the high ground. The battle's over at that point.
That's right.
And yet he still feels like he has to attack. So the town is on the river. The Confederates have plenty of places to snipe and to basically harass the Army of the Potomac while they're trying to build these pontoon bridges. And yeah, there's some artillery, but it's not really used to great effect. So it takes a great deal of effort and loss of life in the engineering corps to get these pontoon bridges actually built and some small number of men across the river. And it's probably at that point when the battle is pretty much decided that it's going to go badly, in my opinion. And you guys can jump in on this. I know I'm kind of laying this out myself here, but it's at that point where when they get some men across that they think they've got the Confederates on the run, because Lee has not positioned his two corps in the town. Right. They're positioned on Marie's Heights, and then what's the other location where Stonewall is?
It's further up, yeah.
Further up, and it's off to, I want to say it's off to Longstreet's right, but I could be wrong, could be incorrect. Either way, the two corps are separated, and the bulk of Longstreet's corps is behind the stone wall in a sunken road, so they are well protected.
Which is just outside the city. just outside the city proper. Which that's something that I think deserves a little bit of understanding is, and I've been to Fredericksburg. I was there 2 years ago. Of course, it's modern now, but you can take the driving tour all over the place, and it puts you at different locations. And when you see the land, the city is between Marye's Heights, where the Confederates are, and the Rappahannock. So that's one of the reasons Burnside is. It's almost like they're laying a trap. When they come across, they're there in the city, and they're distracted by all this stuff.
There's some moving that goes on initially.
Goes on. That's because they're funneled into a narrow point through the main part of the city, and they're peeling themselves off. The movie Gods and Generals, which we'll talk about, I'm sure, does a fantastic job of showing all this because it loses its impetus, and it literally is supposedly this irresistible force that comes up against the absolute immovable object. Because there's no way once you come out beyond the town, you see all those huge field and the Confederates behind a stone wall.
Yeah, Martin, what do you have to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, if it would help for the listeners to picture it, you can kind of picture the Rappahannock running basically north-south. And Burnside's on the eastern side of the river.
Which is ironic, because if he had just turned around, he could have headed straight to Richmond. And there wouldn't have been that much between him and Richmond. Now, granted, Lee would have been able to pursue him because Lee was that much better, but I always found that interesting. He was closer to Richmond than Lee was,
and that was his ultimate objective. At least the way he explained it is that he wants to take on Lee, but he also wants to get to Richmond too.
Yeah. So that's the whole point of this is a movement to circle to Richmond. And initially, Robert's on the money. The Lee's people were not there when he first got to the Rappahannock. But he's got to get across. And there's a huge delay in getting the pontoons shipped down from New York, I think it is. And in that time, Lee's able to bring both Longstreet and Jackson to the battle on the west side of the Rappahannock, to the west of the little town, basically. And
the fatal flaw was those pontoon bridges. This would have been a very different thing if he had those in hand and was able to cross the Rappahannock before the Confederates got there.
You always got to take the high ground.
Well, I think that there were probably enough there at the time of when he was trying to get the pontoons there to keep him where he was, because it only took a very small force on the riverbanks and up into the city to keep the pontoons from being built quickly.
Right.
So, and that was kind of my whole point, and it's part of Martin's point about and yours, Francis, about this booby trap being laid for him. They were trying to funnel him into a narrow corridor, whether intentional or not. The effect was you bunch everybody together, and it only takes a small number of men to keep them occupied, and you're able to funnel them because they're not going to go past these pockets of resistance without trying to take them out. And all the men have to do is fall back and to their next prepared position and keep sniping. So they were able to keep them really busy for a long time.
Yeah, and that was the plan. To draw the Union in through the town, but not really make a big resistance in the town. Just
enough to make a show of it.
Yeah, because they knew they had the high ground. They knew they had the stone wall of Marye's Heights.
And they were prepared there.
Yeah.
It's not like it was a fallback position. That was the primary position. And that's what, today, we would think, well, why couldn't he see that? Well, he didn't have drone coverage. Right. We didn't have satellite coverage.
No satellites,
it was not easy to tell what was going on because he had no way to see that. So when you think about Burnside, the folly of his is partially he brought himself to the battle, not being able to change, but also it was from everything he could see, he had them on the run. So I don't know that very many would have done anything differently. I don't know that Grant would have done anything differently.
Well, yeah, and what was so awful about it is once you get out past the town and up against that, flanking maneuver, which is what they're trying to do, is absolutely impossible. There's just no way to do that. And that's when you get this oh shit moment. You should have. At least the commanders on the ground are saying, we can't do anything. So all we can do is, to go Klingon on you, die well, because that's what they did.
Today is a good day to die.
That's right.
Well,
and so many did.
The attack on the heights over and over and over.
And there's the great sin.
It would have been, it would have been obvious. No, we shouldn't be just charging back up this hill again.
Right. Once, maybe twice. After that, you should have just left it alone. Because they never got closer than about 20 yards, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, they never actually breached the wall, which, in most major battles, you're going to have at least some skirmish at the line that is being attacked. That didn't happen here.
Well, part of the reason for that is two reasons. One, Lee's army is very well trained, they're very well supplied, and they're very well deployed. But also, if you were to take this forward 50, 60 years, World War I, these guys have muskets, smoothbore muskets.
Yeah.
They're notoriously inaccurate. That's one of the reasons that the assaults kept coming, because enough people survived to continue to reform and do it again. If this were World War I, they would have all been mowed completely down.
Right, there were no machine guns. Well, and it's not just so much the there's enough that survived, because division and company after company after company were just shattered against that stone wall.
And they don't even know it's coming, because they're all coming over behind them through the town, over the pontoon bridges. Next thing you know, they're there with all these bodies.
Right, and the guys that are trying to make their way back down, they're in what would eventually be called shell shock and post-traumatic stress.
Absolutely.
They're in the depths of it that quickly. I mean, because it was just an incredible killing ground.
Yeah.
One of my favorite, and it's favorite because it's one of the most poignant moments in the movie Gods and Generals, is when you have the two Irish brigades.
Oh, yes, yes.
Mm-hmm.
One against the other. These are both Catholic groups. It's not like Catholics against the Protestants. And the men at Marie's Heights were brought to tears because they knew who they were fighting. And when you think about where they're coming from in Ireland, for another Catholic Irishman to fire on one to fire on another and to have to slaughter them like that had to be a nearly impossible thing for them to endure.
They showed that so well, because the guys behind, I forget the exact line, but some of the guys behind the wall were saying, "Why don't you run? Why don't you go away? Don't make me kill you."
Right.
And it's because and then you see the emotion and the pathos. There's Martin. There's one of your favorite words.
Yeah.
In this moment, that so perfectly illustrates. I can't say enough good things about that movie, because if you see that and spend the time with it, you understand Fredericksburg very, very well, because they filmed it there, and you can see the way it lays out, and it's very accurate, which really only serves to reinforce our entire premise. This was a folly. This should not have gone on as long as it did.
Right. See, and that's the key here. What makes it a folly is that he couldn't change course.
That's right.
And it was interesting. Even though Longstreet was the one who was being directly attacked, it was Stonewall was actually the only one that was actually ever really threatened, because there's a point which Stonewall sends a message to Longstreet giving him advice, and basically Longstreet says, "Screw you, I got this. You need to look to your own left over there, because you're about to be overrun."
That's right, because he was the flank. And that's the only weak point that there was. Unfortunately, the Federals just didn't really realize that. They kind of blundered into part of it.
Well, and again, that goes back to not having any real-time reconnaissance.
Yeah, no intelligence either, which is odd, because you would have thought they would have known the city better at this point, even though it's not theirs.
Remember, though, this is in the 1860s. It wasn't until the 1870s, 80s, and 90s where the Germans developed the true concept of the General Staff. And the General Staff's job was to war game every contingency.
Right.
And, that's something that we really ought to consider doing an historical episode on, is that innovation. Because it really changed the face of warfare.
The whole concept of military intelligence. Yeah, that's a big deal. And had Burnside had better, I don't know. As you say, he still brought himself. I don't know if he would have changed. There's a moment and Martin and I were talking about this earlier, in the movie where Hancock, it wasn't him that actually had the conversation, but they put him in there because Brian Mallon was the actor. He was saying, this is not going to work. Let me take a corps and go up north and flank these guys, go around. And Burnside famously says, well, the plan's already been approved. And you can just, I don't remember the actor who played Burnside, but it's so perfect. He's looking like, what are you talking about? It's like he's clueless about that.
And that's another thing to look at here. You know, when we think of warfare and how battle plans are put together, it was an entirely different thing in the 1860s. They would call a council of war of all the corps commanders and maybe some of the really good brigade commanders, divisional commanders, and they would discuss things and they'd hash it out, and they would come to some kind of consensus or even a vote. That's so foreign to how we would think about how a war would be prosecuted.
Well, the Germans changed that, and in World War I, and we discovered it don't work that way. It can't work that way.
Grant only did it once, I think.
Pardon?
I think Grant only had the War Council once.
To be honest, I'm probably doing a disservice to Grant. It's not the Germans that created that concept. It was Grant.
Well, yeah, I think it still is the Germans.
Who perfected it, certainly.
But Grant, I don't think he really has a true war general staff in that sense, because he doesn't have a bunch of guys over here wargaming things and coming up with all these contingency plans, because that's really what the general staff does.
Right. Yeah.
What if? But he's not willing to put everything to a vote.
Right. That's what I meant. That's what I was referring to.
He's the first one to stop doing that. So Burnside, when he says the plan has already been approved, he doesn't mean he's already approved it. He means the entire War Council has approved it.
Right.
He doesn't feel like he can change that.
Yeah, exactly.
And which is, again, something that is so foreign to us. In many ways, we like to blame Burnside for this, but as is the case with so many of these historical events and figures that we examine, I don't think we can lay 100% of the blame for this battle and its horrible outcome on Burnside alone. It's partially the structure, the way the Army is built, the way the Army has been governed the entire war, and maybe even before that, I don't know, because it's a very small professional Army prior to the beginning of the war. It's less than 50,000 men.
Yeah, these guys can only do what they know.
Right, they can only do what they know. It's very difficult to innovate in the middle of a battle, and even in the middle of a war. Grant, the reason he is so successful, he and Sherman, is that they have that ability to innovate on the fly.
And they empower that in their commanders as well, which it's very critical that the battles are won and lost by the initiative of good staff, good command brigade, the brigade level in many respects.
Well, I think there's a few sergeants that might disagree with that. But
well,
I understand what you're saying.
I'm trying not to go too deep down in there, but ultimately, it's very micro, and the trick is to be able to manage the macro that emphasizes and celebrates that and empowers that.
Grant is probably the first example that we can see in history of modern day leadership, in the sense that he sets the goal, maybe some broad parameters, but he leaves most of the execution to the guys on the ground.
That's right.
And he expects certain outcomes, but there's more leeway. We don't have that yet here at Fredericksburg. And I forget, because again, there's just so much to try and absorb before we do one of these. But basically, after how many attempts to take Marie's Heights, his corps commanders finally convince him that no, we can't do this. We have to go back, because this is just it's suicide.
Right. Well, it's after one overnight. I mean, there's they stop and literally they camp amongst the dead, those that are surviving there in the Union lines.
There is a brief truce, probably more than once, but there's a brief truce where men are allowed to go out and minister to those who are fallen, which is not uncommon in this war.
Right.
Which it's probably one of the most civil and uncivil civil wars that you will find in that sense, because there's a lot of that.
Francis kind of.
You've been relatively quiet during this particular one. Francis and I have been going to town. What have you got to add?
Francis kind of stole my word that I was going to use there. Again, if a listener is interested in this battle, not only is the film Gods and Generals or the book Gods and Generals a very good portrayal and depiction of these events, but I'll just also mention that the Geoffrey Ward, Ric Burns, and Ken Burns, The Civil War book based on the Ken Burns series also is very good with this battle. But it's very moving that first night with the Union men trapped on the hillside just below Marye's Heights. Again, it's December. The temperature drops, and they're just trapped, living among the dead, including the 20th Maine.
Right.
Yes.
And Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, who would all find glory. Glory. They wouldn't think it was glory, but they saved the Union position at Gettysburg at Little Round Top.
Right. He is not yet in command, but he is.
He's second in command. Yeah.
He's second in command. Yeah.
So it's just a few months later, but the pathos is right. The heartbreaking aspect of this battle and the failure of the Union leadership, again, to call this off and to just, like we say with Moltke, okay, you've gotten punched in the face. Now it's time to change the plan, and they just wouldn't. It was just assault after assault after assault.
Yeah, and in some ways, as I was saying earlier about how you can't lay 100% of the blame for this at Burnside's feet, honestly, I think in some ways you have to lay some of the blame on Lincoln because he was pushing so hard for a vigorous attack.
Yeah.
And after seeing general after general after general be sacked, Burnside, I just think he's got it in his mind that he has got to do whatever it takes, no matter the cost.
Right. Yeah.
And I think all of them probably have that in mind.
Sure. Yeah, it's kind of an inevitable result of what's gone before. And whether Lincoln stated it absolutely or Burnside's believed it, I think it's probably both. The expectation was set that ultimately set the seeds for the doom of this, because they were so eager. They didn't really give a rat's ass. We're going to attack. And that is exactly the wrong way to do this, because when you're up against somebody as clever as Lee, who absolutely just exploited every resource here, and the Federals are kind of blind. And how do you attack?
But at the same time, Lee didn't have to be a genius to get this.
Oh, well, no, that's very true.
Burnside's moving, everything, again, is moving super slow.
Yeah. When we'll talk about next episode with Chancellorsville, there's Lee's genius.
Burnside's dawdling. It's obvious that the thing to do is to take the high ground on the far side of the town and let Burnside come to you.
Yes.
The three of us could have figured this out, just looking at the place. So,
well, even though
especially that stone wall running the length of that field. Good God.
The Marye's Heights, yeah.
But then again, that's against conventional thinking at this time, though. The conventional thinking is maneuver and attack. This is Napoleon. And Lee is visionary enough to foresee that defensive warfare still is valued and indeed wins the day. He's a little bit of a free thinker ahead of time.
Well, that's Longstreet, though. Longstreet's the guy that really knows defensive warfare.
Longstreet is the master of defensive warfare. He's really the first guy who came up with the idea, not the idea, but he really brought to perfection for the time trench warfare.
Yeah.
Now, granted, that's later, but he was so good at using his corps to its best advantage. It was designed and trained to be the anvil that the enemy would basically waste itself against.
Yeah.
And as we see in Chancellorsville, Stonewall may be the hammer, but without that anvil of Longstreet, a lot of what those two together do just don't work out.
That's right.
They really were so complementary. And we don't see it in this battle so much because this is mostly Longstreet's battle.
Right. Yeah, because he's basically bearing the brunt. But then again, it's a defensive war. It's one of the reasons Gettysburg he was so angry at, because he didn't want to do it this way. He was actually forced into the offensive position, which is a place he didn't want to be.
Well, I don't think it was so much that he didn't want to be in the offensive, but he recognized that the roles were reversed, not to the exact same degree,
right?
Because it was, the armies were so spread out, but the conditions, especially for Pickett's charge, were very similar. It wasn't quite the same uphill slope, but as the movie said, no 15,000 men ever arrayed could take that position.
That's right. And he even makes a reference to the fact now they have the stone wall like we had at Fredericksburg.
Yeah. Right. And I don't know if this is historical, but you see in the movie Gettysburg, the men on the Union side, they yell back, Fredericksburg, Fredericksburg, Fredericksburg.
That was Webb's corps, and yes, and not corps, but Webb's division, and yes, that's exactly what they did, because many of them were veterans who recognized
they survived that. Yes.
That they were. This is the comeuppance. This is when things turn around.
Always take the high ground.
Always.
Longstreet was the guy who posited that with the new weapons, as the rifled musket and the breech loaders begin to come online, he's the guy saying, look, to take a position, any kind of single position, is going to take at least 3 men, and 2 of them are going to die in the attempt.
Or at least be wounded.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, he recognizes the power of technology.
That one rifleman can hold off basically 3 people at a time.
At least, yeah. And once you get the breech loaders in there, that number goes up.
Well, yeah, it gets to the point by 1864, the Confederates are saying, them damn Yankees, they load on Sunday and fire all week. Because, a lot of them have those Henry repeating carbines, the cavalry does. Yeah. And they once that becomes almost standard issue, technology has won.
I kind of slighted Lee unintentionally earlier when I talked about Grant being the one of the first to show modern leadership. Really, he's taking a page from Lee to the extreme, because Lee does it first. Lee is very good, unlike McClellan and Burnside and Hooker and all of the others, at saying, all right, this is what we're going to do. Now, it's also his weakness at Gettysburg when he says, take those heights if practicable.
That's right. The commanding general will not allow a flanking movement around those hills as long as
the vague orders, and we'll talk about that at Gettysburg and the Stonewall.
That's right.
What's the difference in the the kind of vague orders that he could give to Stonewall that he couldn't give to the commanders who replaced him? But
Ewell was not the same kind of commander, but nobody was the same kind of commander that
Jackson was.
And nobody was the same kind of commander that Longstreet was when he was out of the war for 9 months. That was a dark period too, because then Lee was down his 2 best people, because Stonewall Jackson was already gone. And it's interesting that that Lee could do that with his guys, with his 2 corps commanders, because Lee, Jackson, and Longstreet, to me, are, in many ways, they're phenomenal generals on their own. Longstreet has a horrible reputation for having the slows, which is totally undeserved.
No, well, compared to Jackson, everybody does.
Well, yes, but his march in the wilderness to get to the battle to save the rest of the Confederate Army is phenomenal. Is as good, if not better, than anything Jackson ever did.
That's right. And he's not well rewarded for it.
And well, as we have often said, Longstreet had the misfortune of not dying of his wounds.
Yes, and becoming a Republican afterwards.
And becoming a Republican, that his 2 cardinal sins there. So, but it's interesting that these 3 together are real. To my mind, they are the key for the Confederacy lasting 4 years. Because if you take any one of them out at the beginning, I think it collapses much sooner. And I think by taking Jackson out at the height, at their high point, people say that the men who reached the stone wall at Gettysburg, that was the high point of the Confederacy, the high water mark. That wasn't the high water. Chancellorsville, to me, was the high water mark.
It is, yeah. It was Lee's genius there.
It was the high water mark at Gettysburg because that was the farthest they ever got in Northern Territory. But as far as military power, it was Chancellorsville. And, those guys, those commanders, they just ran rings around guys like Burnside.
Mm-hmm. And I think Lee understood that too, because after Jackson dies, he takes this marvelous organization of him with 2 corps commanders and breaks it into 3. He recognizes he doesn't have anybody that can take Jackson. It takes 2 guys to take that, so he has to completely and radically reorganize things. I do believe that had a great effect. Longstreet could not be spread any further than he was.
Right, because he didn't have as many men as he used to.
That's right. And the guys, I'm sorry, as much as I admire A.P. Hill, and I'm not a big fan of Baldy Ewell, those guys didn't have it. They really didn't. Hill was very good as a division commander, fantastic division commander. He was
kind of like Burnside.
Exactly.
He could only go so far.
He could only go so far. He was capable. He wasn't like General Hood, who absolutely decimated the Army of Tennessee at the Battle of Franklin, who was way promoted above his abilities.
Yes.
Hill was capable, but just barely. And Ewell was totally out of his depth. And I think when we get to the Gettysburg episode, we'll talk about this more.
Yeah. Well, and this is part of the... So we talk about Burnside's Folly, and it's obviously it's Folly. I don't have the numbers. I don't know if one of you do about the losses here, but...
it was 2-1. I can tell you that. I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but
the ratio was
12,000 Union casualties.
12,000.
Yes, well over 12,000 Union casualties, and a good chunk of those are the men up against Longstreet going up the hillside to Marie's Heights and the stone wall.
So one of the reasons that's one of the reasons why we call this his folly, because in retrospect we can think, oh my God, you were just so stupid to do this. But on the other hand, as far as the prosecution of the war, this is a minor blip for the Union.
Well, that's
true. This, I think, is a great illustration of how the Union was almost destined to win this, especially if it kept dragging on. Mm-hmm. Because look at how many commanders the entire Army of the Potomac went through. And look at all the stuff. Look at how many corps they had.
Oh, yeah.
At one point, the Army of the Potomac was 200,000 men at its height. And granted, Little Mac couldn't figure out that he was not outnumbered 2-1. He outnumbered his opponents by at least 2-1. The war could have been over in 1862 had McClellan pressed his advantage. But the North was able to overcome all of these little follies, and in the grand scheme of things, they are little when you compare to the massive losses at Gettysburg and the crater at Petersburg and all of these other places in the wilderness that both sides endured.
Spotsylvania Cold Harbor would dwarf all of these, or would dwarf this one.
Yeah, but this was politically a disaster. This was something that really Lee's victory in this is not necessarily on the battlefield. It's more at the political area, because people are thinking, we don't have the will or the ability to defeat him. That's what Lee is trying to achieve. I don't think he did, but after a debacle like this, he certainly came closer to that.
Martin?
Well, the political ramifications aren't so much on the Confederate side. It's Burnside's scrambling after this battle. What comes next is known very famously as the Mud March.
Yes.
In January, where he just kind of really doesn't know what to do now. And he's got a bunch of plans. It's January. It starts pouring down rain. And all of this, they just end up sitting in the mud. And basically, the ramifications is that the Army of the Potomac is nearly broken here. their morale. They don't
Yeah.
trust any of the commanders anymore at all.
Right.
So it backs Lincoln into a corner, basically, that, okay, I don't have much choice here. Burnside's really only lost one battle, but everything's a mess.
Yeah.
And I've got to punt and figure out something else.
Yeah.
And
He goes
passed
for Hooker.
on the Army of the Potomac to Joe Hooker here.
Who fighting Joe? That's supposedly
Fighting Joe.
He had the reputation for not being afraid to attack.
Yeah.
Right, which, as we have, I think we have kind of danced around, but yeah, that's almost exactly the wrong kind of general for this war.
Yeah.
You can't always attack.
That's right.
And because this is the war that changed the face. Many consider this to be the first modern war.
Right.
Yeah.
Because of the arms that are involved. It's not fully modern, because that's really World War I.
Right.
Because until you get the machine gun in there, it's not truly modern in the sense that we think of it.
Yeah.
But it's still modern in the sense that you've got massive armies. And it's one of the first wars where warfare is nearly continuous. It's not as continuous as World War I, but there's multiple battles every year, and it's also the first one where it's not basically decided in one or two battles.
Mm-hmm.
When we look at previous wars, you had relatively small armies that met on the battlefield, and one battle usually decided it. Maybe a couple, maybe a series if you got a really good commander on both sides.
Well, Napoleon's kind of the example for a lot of that, because every time he won something, it changed the way the map was drawn.
Right.
And he just kept going, and he kept winning. And those are the tactics that both sides are using, because they see him as this god of warfare, and not realizing that he's 50 years ago. And I think that's a lot of the problem is that Lee, I think, understood better. I know Longstreet did, but most of the rest of them, they didn't get it. They're still fighting like this is Napoleon.
Yeah. Like we talked about, the difference is so many of these guys got that bloody nose and didn't know what to do from there. So it's just go home or like
run back and crawl under the bed.
March around in the mud. And the difference being that Grant understands, if I get a bloody nose, all I've got to do is just come to grips with Lee and stay there.
Right, because the guy who gives you a bloody nose, he's close enough for you to punch back.
That's right. Yeah. Get him in a clinch and stay with him.
Yeah.
Don't let him go.
And that's Burnside's mistake here, in that
he disengages.
There, you've gone too slow. Lee's caught up to you. There's no possibility now of crossing the Rappahannock and making a success of this. But instead of going home, just stay, make a new plan, and find a way to come to grips with Lee and keep going.
Rather than recrossing the Rappahannock to go back to where you started. If he had stayed where he was, he at least would have been closer to Lee, could have kept a better eye on him.
Yeah.
You didn't have to attack him, but because eventually, if he sits there long enough, Lee's going to want to attack him.
That's right.
And this is something that they don't get, because in their mind, and this is the mind of almost every general of the time, it is horrible to be on the defense, because the attacker, in their mind, is the guy who's going to win. And that's not the way this works all the time. Eventually it does.
Yeah, you think if they studied Waterloo, they'd realize it. But Wellington wins Waterloo because he fights a 100% defensive battle against the great attacker, and he neutralizes him.
Right.
And yet, for some reason, they don't think that way.
Right. And and of course, the scale here is unheard of. This is something that nobody's ever dealt with before. So I think there's some forgiveness in that sense too. That how do you deal with the fact that you've lost 12,000 men? This is not something that is in anybody's experience. Anybody who's lost 12,000 men has been utterly defeated.
Yeah.
Yet the Army of the Potomac, had it been better led, was not utterly defeated. Now, morally, in the sense of morale, not morally, but in the sense of morale, yes, it was utterly defeated. Yeah. But it was not utterly defeated as a fighting force. It was not smashed and dispersed.
Right.
Whereas 12,000 casualties in an earlier war would have dispersed the army.
Yeah.
These are professionals, and it's funny. The men on the ground are the professionals. The generals are kind of the amateurs learning as they go.
Yeah, unfortunately, with a few exceptions.
With a few exceptions. Unfortunately, the guys who are learning as they go, the cost is the men on the ground.
And, I think that's the thing that really is the great tragedy here, is those 12,000 men should have never died, that many of them. And it was just, that's why we give Burnside such a bad reputation, is because of the men who died needlessly, is how history has judged it. Now, it's a little bit more complicated. As Trevor Slattery would say, it's complicated.
Now, he didn't lose as many men as Mac did at Antietam.
Right.
But because he's coming off of Antietam, this is horrible to their morale.
Yes.
And things are only going to get worse.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because
this is the battle after which Lincoln famously says, "If there's a worse place than hell, I am in it."
Right. He's very much right, because for the next 6 months, things do not go well until Gettysburg. And even at Gettysburg, it's not a sure thing until the end.
Right.
And even after Gettysburg, nothing really happens until 1864. So they're all learning this on the job. Even Lincoln's learning it on the job, but because he has kind of that same thing, attack, attack, attack. But he understands attack, 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 because we have all of the benefits. We have all of the advantages. We have more men. We have more material. We have more arms. We have, if not necessarily better arms, they're coming soon. And that's what I think what we talked about. Lee, I don't know if he necessarily understood it to that same degree that I just laid it out, because he was also more concerned with defending Virginia than he was with anything else. When he moved into Maryland and Pennsylvania in the two campaigns in 1862 and 1863, they were seen as ways to they're twofold. One, get the Army of the Potomac out of your home state.
Right.
And two, get your army out of your home state so you can, stop eating up all the food that the civilians need.
Forage off the enemy.
Right, forage off the enemy. And it's just such a different way of looking at things. I don't know. It just seems interesting after all this discussion that, I have more sympathy for Burnside doing this episode than I ever did before.
I would agree with you on that. He was in an untenable position, and the tragedy is kind of the Shakespearean tragedy. He knew it. He knew it going in. He knew he couldn't do this, but he tried. He was not a coward. He was a brave man.
Yeah.
And I would like to, and we don't really have time to get into his thoughts after the fact, because he did write some stuff afterwards. He eventually became the governor of Rhode Island.
Yes.
Had a fairly successful. He's one of the few generals that, when they're sacked from the highest command, that is actually fed back into the system, and he goes on to command a corps, and as well he is involved in the West for a long time after this. He was at Chickamauga along with Longstreet, believe it or not. Both of them are from the East, and yet they made that happen. And he is famously or infamously responsible for the crater at Petersburg, which is kind of ends up being a black mark against him again, which is not really fair. He was trying to execute the orders he was given.
He was,
and things.
The crater was such a cluster to begin with, but
yes,
if I remember correctly, it was not him that made the change, the last minute.
Correct. That's correct.
And that probably has more to do with the failure, and the fact that nobody really understood how big of an explosion that was going to be.
Well, yeah, they were innovating.
Right.
Which is something that Burnside doesn't do well anyway, as we've seen. So he doesn't really know what's going to happen. He has a better plan, and they pulled out. I mean, he was supposed to send in a corps, not a corps, but a group of black soldiers who were trained for this, And they changed it at the last second, saying, no, we don't want you to do that. We think that will enrage, they'll never make it out alive. We've got to send in white guys.
Well, and I think that there was also a little bit of the racism of the day, that we can't trust this black soldier.
That's exactly right. It was both of that. There was, and this is done at the last second. So you've got, and they go in. They don't have any siege ladders to get out. So
because they have to go into a big pit and then climb out. So in a way, it's Fredericksburg all over in a very tiny setting.
Exactly, and it was.
And one of the commanders responsible, the sub-commanders under Burnside, is in his tent drunk off his ass.
Yes, the guy who's responsible for executing the plan on the ground is drunk off his ass.
Yeah, so that's not Burnside's fault.
Right, but no, by no means. But he gets the blame only because he got the blame before.
You blame the guy at the top. That's in this war, that's definitely the case. And in most places, it's definitely the case. You blame the guy at the top. So Burnside's folly was definitely, you got to lay the majority of the blame for Fredericksburg at his feet, because he wouldn't change the plan soon enough. I think we can. I think we're all in agreement there that it's definitely his. Yeah. He's got to own this particular one.
Yeah.
Ultimately,
I think my assessment's a little harsher than you guys. To me, the knowing Lee is over there, you've gone too slow. Lee's caught up to you. You've got to do something different. You've got to figure out something different than just charging across into the town and up the heights. It's never going to work. So I think my assessment's a little harsher. If it's all right,
I think we probably agree with that. I think we're probably more willing to give weight to some what we would consider mitigating factors.
Yeah, I really lay the blame once they get beyond and start charging Marie's Heights. I get once, I get twice. I do not get for 24 hours. That's where I think Burnside, if he's the Army commander, that should never have gone on as long as it did. He should have had the guts to realize this isn't working. Let's go. And that's where I think he failed as a leader. He should have seen that. It's not like the guys underneath him didn't tell him. So it's not. He had the intelligence, as in the information, and didn't act on it.
Right.
That to me is a big problem.
Guys, Bruce Catton, one of my favorite Civil War authors. I've got a bunch of his stuff, and I love it. I think he's probably the best Civil War author ever. Pulitzer Prize winner. His assessment in a book called Mr. Lincoln's Army of Burnside. I'll quote this. Burnside had repeatedly demonstrated that it had been a military tragedy to give him a rank higher than colonel. One reason might have been that with all his deficiencies, Burnside never had any angles of his own to play. He was a simple, honest, loyal soldier, doing his best, even if that best was not very good.
Well, that's true. Nobody ever disliked Burnside.
Yeah.
You don't ever hear that.
Yeah.
He doesn't make excuses. He doesn't blame his subordinates. He takes his lumps and says, I'm the guy in charge. The buck stops with me, and that endeared him to many.
He was well thought of by
he was
the generals. Yeah.
Well, I think that's very evident in the fact that he wasn't cashiered out of the service or sent off somewhere, to guard some tiny little fort in North Dakota that nobody had ever heard of, and which is what happened to a lot of people.
And he offered. He offered to resign.
And he offered to follow the course,
and they wouldn't do it.
Sorry, it's listeners. One of the difficulties with recording like this is that it's easier to talk over one another than it used to be, because we got much better at that as a group. Because we were really bad at it for a while, but we got much better. But the technology doesn't always lend itself to not doing that. But I guess I'm trying to come up with a good way to summarize this in terms of our pointless discussions of eternal questions. Because I like it when we can come around to this. And honestly, I'm having a little bit of a hard time with this one, because there's so many lessons you could take out of this. One, what the hell are you doing attacking uphill against an entrenched position? listen to your subordinates. I mean, there's just so many personal failures in this battle. You know, this is probably one of the things that makes this battle different than many others that we like to talk about, is that most of the failures and points of what if are personal decisions or lack thereof.
Yeah.
As opposed to something like Gettysburg, where what if Chamberlain had not gotten to the top of Little Round Top as fast as he did. If he'd been an hour or two later, the South would have rolled up the Union lines, because they would have flanked them and just rolled them up. This is a little bit different. This is what if he had just decided something different. So I guess this is kind of the opposite. If you want to take a lesson out of this, or a point, is that one man truly can make a difference in a battle. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. And obviously in Fredericksburg, it's bad. It's very bad. Even though the extent of the losses are not nearly as great as in something like Antietam or Gettysburg, it's just it's almost a clinic of how not to do a battle.
Yeah. I think for me, the reason to discuss this battle, the reason to talk about Fredericksburg at all, is again that what we talk about, that pathos, that sympathizing with those men trapped below the stone wall on Marie's Heights, trapped overnight.
Listening to the dying. They can't get water. They can't get treatment. Something very unusual happened that night. You could see the Aurora Borealis that far south that night. And it moved the men at the time. Sort of even God's taking notice of our plight here kind of thing. And again, what you talked about, these men tied together, Irishman versus Irishman kind of, they were close enough to see each other. They were close enough to know who was on the other side of that wall, and it almost broke everybody's heart. Yeah.
So that's. I hope this spurs the listener to think about that end of it, and it's why Fredericksburg's worth looking at, not just as an example of, gee, here's what not to do in a mid-19th century warfare.
Right, there's a personal tragedy aspect.
Yeah, there's stories here. Again, we talked about gods and generals in the description of that pathos in the Ronald Maxwell's film. Is a very accurate. What do you call it?
Portrayal, representation.
Portrayal, yes, of the novel.
It's a shame the third movie never got made. The last full measure.
It was a great book.
Yes.
So, a tip of the hat to Geoffrey Shaara for the film, or for the novel, and Ronald Maxwell for the film. Check these out. It's very moving, and it'll make you want to tilt a glass to those men.
Yeah, and the movie is not just Fredericksburg. It is through Chancellorsville, because it ends with Stonewall's death.
Right. It's really Stonewall's story in
It's Stonewall's story.
It's not just him, but it's primarily him.
Right.
It's a good portrayal of the man.
Stephen Lang was phenomenal.
He was phenomenal. And I remember when we had a discussion when we heard he was named for this, because he just played Pickett, we're thinking, huh? What? How can you possibly take him who played Pickett so well and make him play Stonewall Jackson? But he nailed it. He nailed it so well.
Stephen Lang is a phenomenal actor.
Phenomenal actor. That's correct.
He really is. So, we could keep pummeling this expired equine, but I think we've probably tapped just about all the things we want to talk about here. Gentlemen, any final comments you want to add? Because I think we've done a pretty good job of summarizing this, but one last word? No? So, Francis, what do we have up next?
Oh, we're going back to Code of Honor next time. One of our favorite, we love doing this. We always manage to take who knows what we pull from where we pull it and put it all together, and somehow Robert makes it all work. I wasn't going to say that, but you're welcome to. Robert somehow manages to make it all work. I'll give you the credit on that because you always go last. We've kind of discovered that, and somehow we don't really play with that too much. We manage to go very universal, very relevant, very human in all sorts of ways, and words that you can use. There's great wisdom there. We didn't write them, but we certainly the heck will explore them. So tune in next time and join us. We know that you'll love it. Thanks so very much.
Thanks for being with us here every week at Snakes and Otters, a pointless discussion of eternal questions. Be sure to spread the word on your social media accounts. Follow us and retweet us. We're on. I'm Martin.
I'm Robert.
And I'm Francis. Catch us next week. Same snake time, same otter channel.